Walter's jacket was a faded olive drab, the kind of military surplus you'd find in a thrift store, its patches worn to threads. A faint tattoo peeked from beneath his rolled-up sleeve, a blurred anchor and eagle, the ink dulled by decades. His eyes, sharp despite the lines etched around them, scanned the laminated menu with a kind of detached habit, as if he already knew he'd order the same black coffee and toast he'd had every morning for years. The waitress, a young woman with a quick smile and a name tag reading Kelly, refilled his mug without a word. She didn't notice the way his fingers lingered on the edge of a folded letter tucked in his pocket, its creases soft from years of handling. The diner's door swung open, letting in a gust of cool air and a group of teenagers in Letterman jackets, their voices loud with the confidence of youth. They slid into a booth near the window, their laughter drowning out the soft croon of a Johnny Cash song on the jukebox. Walter didn't look up, but his shoulders stiffened slightly, a reflex from years of staying out of sight. He was used to being invisible, another old man in a town that had moved on, its streets now lined with chain stores and its memories of the past buried under new pavement. Kelly approached the counter, her notepad in hand, and called out to a man in a crisp suit who'd just walked in. "Morning, Mr. Hargrove. Usual table?" The man nodded, barely glancing at Walter as he brushed past. Hargrove was a local councilman, a regular at the diner, known for his polished speeches at veterans' events and his knack for shaking hands. Today he carried a stack of flyers for the upcoming Veterans Day ceremony at the town square, a small affair with a flag raising and a speech no one would remember. Walter's eyes flicked to the flyers as Hargrove set them on the counter. One slid free, landing near his coffee mug. The bold text read, "Willow Creek honors our heroes. Veterans Day ceremony. All veterans welcome." His lips pressed into a thin line, and he pushed the flyer away with a calloused finger. He'd seen these events before, parades and platitudes, where the town clapped for men like him but never asked their names. He'd stopped going years ago, after the last time he tried to attend and was turned away at the gate. "Names not on the list," the organizer had said, barely looking up from his clipboard. Walter had stood there, clutching an invitation he'd received decades ago, his service reduced to a bureaucratic oversight. That day the memory of it still stung. It wasn't anger that lingered, but a quiet ache, the kind that settles in your bones when the world forgets what you carried. Walter had been a Marine in Vietnam, a radio operator in the jungles of Quang Tri, humping a 30-pound radio through mud and gunfire. He'd called in airstrikes that saved his platoon, patched wounds under fire, and buried friends before he was 20. But those stories lived only in his head now, locked away with the medals he kept in a cigar box under his bed. The town didn't know. No one asked. The diner's door chimed again and a man in a dress uniform stepped inside. He was young, maybe 30, with the silver bars of a captain on his shoulders and a bearing that commanded attention. The room quieted for a moment, the teenagers glancing up from their phones. The captain scanned the diner, his eyes landing on Hargrove, who waved him over. "Captain Ruiz. Good to see you. Grab a seat, we'll go over the ceremony details." Walter's gaze lingered on the captain's uniform, the crisp lines of his service dress blues, the glint of a combat action ribbon pinned to his chest. For a moment he was back in '69, the weight of his own uniform heavy with sweat and dust. He blinked and the memory faded. He took a sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding him. Hargrove and Ruiz talked in low tones, their voices carrying just enough for Walter to catch fragments. "Need a good turnout this year," Hargrove said, tapping a flyer. "Folks are forgetting what it's all about. We've got the mayor, the high school band, and you giving the keynote. But we need to fill the square." Ruiz nodded, his expression serious. "I'll do my part. But it's the veterans we're here for. We need to make sure they feel it." His eyes flicked toward Walter, a brief glance, but Walter had already turned back to his coffee, his face unreadable. Kelly approached Walter, her smile faltering as she noticed his untouched toast. "Everything okay, hon?" she asked, her voice soft but distracted. Before he could answer, Hargrove called her over, asking for a refill. She hurried away, leaving Walter's question hanging in the air. He didn't mind. He was used to it. But then came the moment that shifted the morning's quiet rhythm. Hargrove, gathering his flyers, knocked one to the floor. It landed near Walter's stool, and as he bent to pick it up, his folded letter slipped from his pocket. It hit the linoleum with a soft thud, unnoticed by Hargrove or Kelly, who were now deep in conversation with Ruiz. Walter froze, his hand halfway to the letter, his heart suddenly loud in his chest. The letter was old, its edges yellowed, but the words inside were as sharp as the day they were written, a commendation from his CO, praising his courage under fire. He hadn't shown it to anyone in years, but he carried it always, a tether to a life no one saw. One of the teenagers, a lanky boy with a football patch on his jacket, noticed the letter and snorted. "Yo, what's that, Grandpa?" "Your grocery list." His friends laughed, their voices sharp in the small diner. Walter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, reaching for the letter with a steady hand. The boy leaned over, his curiosity half mocking. "Seriously, what's it say? Looks ancient." Walter's eyes met the boy's, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something, not anger but a quiet weight, like the calm before a storm. "It's just a letter," he said, his voice low, rough from years of silence. He tucked it back into his pocket, but the boy's laughter lingered, a small cut in the morning's peace. Captain Ruiz, still seated with Hargrove, had been watching. His gaze lingered on Walter, on the way his hands moved with purpose, on the faded tattoo half hidden by his sleeve. There was something in the old man's posture, a stillness that spoke of discipline, of burdens carried and never shared. Ruiz leaned forward, his voice cutting through the diner's hum. "Excuse me, sir," he said, addressing Walter directly. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" The diner went quiet. Kelly paused mid-pour and the teenager's laughter faltered. Walter looked up, surprised, his eyes narrowing slightly as if testing the captain's intent. "Suit yourself," he said, his tone neutral but guarded. Ruiz slid onto the stool beside him, his uniform crisp against the worn counter. "I'm Captain Ruiz, Marine Corps. I'm helping with the Veterans Day ceremony." "You served, didn't you?" It wasn't a question, not really. There was a certainty in Ruiz's voice, a recognition that came from one warrior to another. Walter hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of his pocket where the letter rested. "A long time ago," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Vietnam. Marines." Ruiz nodded, his eyes steady. "Semper Fi," he said softly, the words carrying a weight that filled the space between them. Walter's lips twitched, not quite a smile but something close. For the first time that morning he felt seen. Hargrove, still standing nearby, cleared his throat. "Captain, we should get going. The committee's waiting to finalize the program." His tone was polite but impatient, as if Walter's presence was a distraction. Ruiz didn't move. Instead, he turned to Hargrove, his voice calm but firm. "One moment, sir. I think we've got someone here who deserves to be part of this." Walter's hand tightened around his mug, his heart thudding with a mix of pride and unease. He wasn't used to attention, didn't want it. But Ruiz's gaze held no pity, only respect, and that was something Walter hadn't felt in years. The diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. What happened in that moment and the hours that followed would ripple through Willow Creek, a reminder that valor doesn't always shout, it whispers in the quiet courage of those who carry on unseen. But for now, the story pauses here, with Walter's past still folded in his pocket, and a town on the cusp of remembering what it had forgotten. To be continued in Part 2 of Unsung Valor. Subscribe to Grateful Stories to follow Walter's journey and discover how one small act of recognition can change a community forever. The diner's air hung thick with the scent of coffee and the faint tang of grease, the jukebox now silent as Johnny Cash's last notes faded. Outside, the Willow Creek morning stirred, the American flag above the door snapping in a brisk November gust. Walter Gaines sat at the counter, his calloused fingers still curled around his mug, the weight of Captain Ruiz's words, Semper Fi, lingering like a pulse. The young Marine captain sat beside him, his dress blues a stark contrast to Walter's faded jacket, his silver bars catching the diner's fluorescent light. The room felt smaller now, the eyes of the teenagers, Kelly the waitress and Councilman Hargrove all drawn to the quiet exchange. Ruiz leaned forward, his voice low but deliberate. "Vietnam, you said. What was your MOS?" His tone carried no judgment, only the curiosity of a man who knew the weight of service. Walter's eyes flicked to the counter, tracing the grain of the worn laminate. "Radio operator," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Humped a PRC-25 through Quang Tri. Called in air support mostly. Kept the lines open." He paused, the memories rising unbidden, jungle heat, the crackle of static, the weight of a friend's blood on his hands. He pushed them down, his face unreadable. "Long time ago." Ruiz nodded, his gaze steady as if he could see the ghosts Walter carried. "Quang Tri was rough. My grandfather talked about it." "You were in the thick of it, weren't you?" Walter's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Thick enough." He didn't elaborate. He never did. The commendation letter in his pocket, yellowed and creased, held the details. A night in '69 when he'd stayed at his radio under fire, calling in a strike that saved his platoon. The CO had called it heroism. Walter called it doing his job. Hargrove cleared his throat again, his impatience breaking the moment. Captain, we really need to get to the committee meeting. The mayor's expecting us. He glanced at Walter, his smile polite but thin, the kind that dismissed without words. I'm sure this gentleman has stories, but we've got a ceremony to plan. The teenagers in the booth snickered, the lanky one from before muttering, Yeah, Grandpa's got stories. Probably about walking uphill both ways. His friends laughed, their voices sharp, slicing through the diner's warmth. Walter's jaw tightened, but he didn't look at them. He'd heard worse over the years, jokes about old grunts, assumptions he was just another retiree with nothing but time. The letter in his pocket felt heavier, its words a silent rebuke to their ignorance. He started to slide off the stool, ready to leave the moment behind, when Ruiz's hand rested lightly on his arm. Hold on, sir, Ruiz said, his voice calm but firm like an order wrapped in respect. He turned to Hargrove, his eyes narrowing slightly. This man's a Marine. He's got more right to be at that ceremony than anyone on your list. What's your name, sir? Walter hesitated, his instinct to fade back into the shadows warring with the captain's steady gaze. Walter Gaines, he said finally, his voice barely carrying over the diner's hum. Ruiz stood, his posture straight, and extended his hand. Captain Daniel Ruiz, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. It's an honor, Mr. Gaines. The handshake was firm, deliberate, and the diner went quiet again, the teenagers' laughter dying in their throats. Kelly, wiping down the counter, paused, her eyes flicking between the two men. Hargrove shifted uncomfortably, clutching his stack of flyers. Well, of course all veterans are welcome, he said, his tone smoothing over the earlier dismissal. But we do need to verify service for the honored guest list. Protocol, you know. Walter's hand brushed his pocket, where the letter lay. He could have pulled it out, let the faded words speak for him, for extraordinary courage under fire, but he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he met Hargrove's eyes, his voice quiet but unyielding. I don't need a guest list to know where I've been. Ruiz's lips curved into a small, approving smile. He turned to Hargrove, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mr. Gaines will be at the ceremony. I'll make sure of it. And I'd like him to sit with the honored veterans. Front row. Hargrove blinked, caught off guard, but nodded quickly. Of course, Captain. We'll make it happen. He glanced at Walter as if seeing him for the first time and offered a weak smile. We'd be glad to have you, Mr. Gaines. The teenagers were silent now, their phones forgotten, watching the exchange with a mix of curiosity and unease. The lanky boy shifted in his seat, his bravado gone. Kelly, sensing the shift in the room, approached Walter with a fresh pot of coffee. On the house today, she said softly, her smile genuine this time. Thank you for your service. Walter nodded, his throat tight. He wasn't used to this, attention, gratitude, the weight of eyes that suddenly saw him. He murmured a quiet thanks, his voice rough, and took a sip of the fresh coffee, its warmth grounding him. Ruiz pulled a notebook from his pocket and jotted something down. Mr. Gaines, I'd like to hear more about Quang Tri if you're willing. Maybe after the ceremony. I think there's a lot this town could learn from you. He paused, his eyes meeting Walter's with a quiet intensity. I'll make sure your name's on that list. And I'll be looking for you at the square. Walter didn't know what to say. He wasn't one for speeches or promises. But something in Ruiz's voice, in the way he carried himself, reminded Walter of his old platoon. Men who didn't need to shout to be heard. He nodded, a single sharp motion. I'll be there. The captain stood, saluting Walter with a crispness that made the diner feel like a parade ground. Semper Fi, Marine. Then he turned to Hargrove, gesturing toward the door. Let's get to that meeting. As they left, the diner slowly returned to its rhythm. The clink of plates, the murmur of conversation, the jukebox kicking back to life with a Willie Nelson tune. But something had shifted. The teenagers were quieter now, their glances at Walter less mocking, more curious. Kelly lingered near his stool, refilling his mug again, her smile softer. You're a Marine, huh? She said, almost to herself. My grandpa was Army. He'd have liked you. Walter didn't respond, but his eyes softened, and he gave her a small nod. He reached for the letter in his pocket, his fingers brushing its familiar creases. He didn't need to read it to know what it said, but he pulled it out anyway, unfolding it carefully on the counter. The paper was fragile, the ink faded, but the words still held power. For actions above and beyond the call of duty. Kelly's eyes widened as she caught a glimpse of the letter. Is that? She trailed off, not wanting to pry. Walter folded it back up, tucking it away. "Just a letter," he said again, but this time his voice carried a hint of pride, a crack in the armor he'd worn for years. The Veterans Day ceremony was 2 days away, and Willow Creek was already preparing. The town square was strung with bunting, the flagpole polished, the high school band practicing off-key renditions of Sweet Caroline. But for Walter, the real preparation was internal, a slow reckoning with the idea of being seen, of stepping back into a world that had long since moved on. That afternoon, as he walked home through streets lined with red and gold leaves, he passed the town square. A group of volunteers was setting up chairs, their laughter carrying on the wind. One of them, a young woman in a Veterans Day committee jacket, noticed him and waved. "You coming to the ceremony, sir?" she called, her voice bright. Walter paused, his hand in his pocket, the letter's weight steady against his chest. "Might be," he said, his voice carrying further than he expected. She smiled, unaware of the storm of memory and hope stirring in him. As he continued down the street, the flag above the square snapped in the breeze, its stars bright against the gray sky. For the first time in years, Walter felt the pull of something bigger than himself. Not the war, not the medals, but the possibility that his story, quiet as it was, might still matter. The ceremony would bring more than Walter expected. A moment that would ripple through Willow Creek, touching lives he'd never met, and reminding a town of the heroes it had overlooked. But that moment, and the truth of Walter's past, would unfold under the open sky, where the weight of a salute and the power of a single letter would change everything. This is the conclusion of Unsung Valor. Subscribe to Grateful Stories to discover more tales of quiet heroism and the small acts of kindness that remind us to honor those who walk among us, unseen but unforgettable.